relationships, the abuse continues after they leave. It sometimes gets worse. It's more difficult for the woman to manage because they're no longer sharing a home. Where is he going to pop up next? Is he going to be at her exercise class at the gym? Is he going to be in the grocery store while she's looking at the onions? Is he going to be lurking around outside the children's school? Is he going to show up at her father's 95th birthday party? There's a way that many women both feel and are, at least in the short term, safer to stay. And so we keep putting the responsibility on her to be the one who's in control of whether she stays or leaves. But as FKA Twigs says really effectively, I think, because she says it so simply, the abuse itself made it impossible for me to leave. Any other comments there, Laura?
There's a couple of just statements. Someone notes that there's a lot of confusion when being abused: love, fear, hope, so many reasons to list. People really don't understand, so they ask the question. They have to live it to really understand. I often ask someone who uses violence and states, "She pushes my buttons all the time." Why do you stay with someone who pushes your buttons? Why do you stay with them? What choices do you have?
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Whoever you are, keep on. I just think that's a marvelous way to just turn this whole question on its head. And I think even if the person isn't saying she pushes my buttons, I think it's a logical question to ask someone who's engaging in abusive behavior. Questions like, well, probably it doesn't make you really happy to do that. No. So why would you stay with someone who makes you want to behave that way? But we very few people do that, especially the public, right? Family members, friends, neighbors. The focus always seems to be on the woman. Well, why didn't you leave? Well, you could leave anytime. There's a shelter down the street, or whatever the rationale is.
A few more comments, Pam. It's asking the question to someone that is being victimized that they have had a choice to not being victimized. I heard a lot, "Why didn't you tell me?" But that is such a judgmental question, which is a big reason why they weren't told to begin with. Also shame, even misplaced guilt.
I think shame's a big one. We live in a culture that, in my opinion, overvalues relationships of coupledom. There's a lot of pressure on people to get into a relationship, right? That you're not whole, there's something wrong with you if you're single. What a bunch of nonsense. It's a great life to live as a single person. Sometimes it's a great life to live in a partnership. But so we grow up thinking that we have this path ahead of us, especially for women, that we will get into a relationship, that we'll have children. Turns out it's not a happy relationship. In fact, our partner is abusive to us. Well, now we've got this shame. We picked this person. What does that say about me? That the person I picked to share my life with would treat me like this. I better stick around because maybe it's about me. Again, I'm telling you things that all of you have heard, I'm sure, in your work, where women will say, "I had no idea this had ever happened to another woman until, I called the shelter, or I went to a support group, or what have you." So there's a way that women in these relationships can feel incredibly isolated, can feel as though, if I was just a better wife, if I was a better mother, I could make some better dinners, because that's what the abuser is saying. The abuser always has a way of making it look to the victim of the abuse as though his behavior is justified. I had a really rotten day at work. You knew that I was going to have a really difficult day, and yet I come home and the house is a mess. I come home and you haven't done anything to get supper started. Ignoring the fact that maybe she was at work all day too, or maybe she was at work at home all day too with 2 kids, especially nowadays when we're all trying to work from home and have our children with us as well. This is such a huge piece to unpack. I think it's really important. I don't believe in simple solutions to something that's as complicated as the violence that happens in intimate relationships. But I do think that if we could tackle this question of why people keep asking, why didn't she just leave? and come up with language like, Laura, what you read a few minutes ago that somebody is using with the person who causes the harm, I think we could start to change the dynamic of this conversation considerably. I really like this interview. The whole interview is good, but I really like this interview because here we have a young woman, very young woman, a famous woman, a woman who's up on public stages performing all of the time, presumably quite privileged in terms of her economic situation, sitting and just saying the abuse itself became the reason why I couldn't leave. And I think that's a powerful message, a message that young women may be able to hear better than the way it's been put in the past. I think this is a really important interview. Any other comments, Laura?
That's it for the questions and comments at this time, Pam.
That's great, thanks. So convenient that both of you monitoring the chat are called Laura. So let's keep thinking about this question of leaving. And FKA Twigg talked about feeling, she wanted the question to turn into one that's asked of the abuser, why are you holding your partner hostage? Jess Hill, in her book, See What You Made Me Do, which is an investigation into domestic violence, says, and this is what you have on your screen, most people still think of domestic violence and abuse as a set of discrete incidents, assaults, put downs, threats. But when it comes to coercive control, which is akin to hostage taking, we're talking about a system of abuse that operates like a cobweb, each strand pulling tighter and tighter until it feels there is truly no way out. This is not just abuse or ill treatment, it's entrapment. Leaving will carry such serious consequences that it is actually safer to comply and to stay. So why am I spending all this time on the issue of why women don't leave or why women stay or go back when we're here to talk about language? Well, it's because how we talk about the abuse itself can help women themselves feel validated in the choices they make, including a choice to stay. How we talk about what intimate partner abuse is can profoundly affect how the public thinks about it. And I think Jess Hill summarizes that really effectively here. It is true that people who don't work in this area, I'm generalizing, which isn't fair, but many people who don't work in this area do think of domestic violence as a set of discrete incidents. So it'll be, he hit her last month, but he hasn't done anything for 4 weeks, right? Or he threatened her, but that was because he was afraid she was going to leave him, and that's not happening right now. Yeah, he put her down that one time, or he puts her down from time to time, but in between, they have a pretty good relationship. Coercive control, which is the kind of intimate partner abuse I'm the most concerned about, and that is a lot more common than I think is often acknowledged, we're not talking about a series of discrete incidents. So when we talk about intimate partner abuse, we need to talk about coercive control. We need to use that term, which now appears in the Divorce Act and in the Children's Law Reform Act. We need to use the language of fear so that people understand we're not talking about things like somebody on a Friday night throwing something across the room at their partner. We're putting that discrete incident into a bigger context, one that creates a climate of constant fear, one that means that the victim of that behavior is losing her agency, losing her autonomy, is, as Jess Hill says it, entrapped. And I think her analogy to a cobweb is a really, really effective one. If we talk really clearly in the world of intimate partner abuse about that, about the fact that it is a pattern of behaviors that all fit together, people will better understand what we're talking about. Part of the result of better understanding will be that people begin to understand why somebody would stay in an abusive relationship and wouldn't minimize the abuse by saying, well, it couldn't have been that bad, or she would have left. Let's go back to these words, alleged and allegation. Somebody brought this up a bit earlier. I'm taking what I have here from a really great resource called Use the Right Words. That link will take you to it. This is a publication put out by an organization called Femifesto. It's aimed at the media, but there's a lot that we can all learn from it about how to use language appropriately. And that publication, Use the Right Words, says that when we use these terms, alleged, allegation, or claimed, excessively, they can imply disbelief of the survivor. And I think that's what the person who commented earlier was getting at. So let's think about the difference in tone between these two statements. The alleged perpetrator has been charged with assault, let's say, or John Smith has been charged with assault. That's a fact. This particular individual has been charged with assault. So why don't we just say his name? Why would we say the alleged perpetrator? As soon as we say alleged, we're casting a hint of doubt into the story of the victim. Person has not been found guilty yet, and I'm glad to live in a country where we're all presumed guilty until we're proven, we're all presumed innocent until we're proven guilty. But simply saying James Brown has been charged with assault, that's a matter of public record. It's not judgmental. It's a statement of fact. And it takes out, at least in my opinion, this, oh, well, it's been alleged, who's to say? Or let's think about a different example. The woman alleged or the woman claimed that she was attacked as she entered her apartment. What if we just changed alleged or claimed to the woman reported that? Or according to the woman, she was attacked as she entered her apartment. So we haven't said that we know she's correct, right? We're keeping it in that context of it's her words. She reported this, or according to her. But to me, those are words that are more respectful to the woman than saying, yeah, she claimed she got attacked as she came into the apartment, or she alleged that she got attacked when she came into the apartment. Anybody have any thoughts about that? How do you deal with that? I mean, we can't make statements that aren't true. So we can't say John Brown assaulted Mary Smith. Even if they're convicted of it, really the best we can say is John Brown was found guilty of. But we can get rid of the overuse, what I think is the overuse of the terms alleged, allegation, and claimed. So does anybody have any comments that you'd like to jump in with there? I don't know which Laura's in charge here.
I'm going to monitor. There is something that came up. I use the term reported, stated, or shared instead of using terms like alleged.
I like shared too. That's a good one.
Here's something interesting. Even parole board will redact information and say it's for the victim's safety, but it isn't actually. The offender gets the unredacted version, but victims don't. Make sure you think. Same with publication bans. They don't necessarily protect the victim.
Well, I'm really happy that somebody said the words publication ban, because I just want to share an ongoing story that some of you may have read about in the media just this week. Publication bans were put in place for good reason, to protect the privacy of victims of intimate crimes in particular, but not exclusively sexual assault. So they're a good thing in concept. But in a recent case somewhere, well, it doesn't matter, it's in the media, in Kitchener, a woman after the trial in which the accused was found guilty shared the transcript of that decision with her family and with some friends, so they would know what had happened in the case. I don't know how the accused person, well, now the guilty person, found out about that, but he did. And he convinced the police to charge her with breaching a publication ban. And the Crown Attorney decided to prosecute. Like many people who've been through a criminal process, this woman was not particularly interested in being dragged through as an accused person. I mean, she was the victim of the crime, of the real crime. And so she made the decision to enter a guilty plea. So she now has been found guilty because she pleaded guilty of breaching a publication ban. And she's had a very large fine, $2,000 plus a victim fine surcharge imposed against her. So this isn't really about language, but somebody said publication ban. So you're going to hear what I have to say about this, whether it's relevant or not. But it stands as a really good example of how systems that get put in place with the intention of protecting victims can be twisted by a persistent and clever abuser so that they end up being used against them. Any other comments about how we're using language in this area?
Yep, there is a comment. When my ex stalked and harassed me, he pled guilty. He signed a peace bond. Now it doesn't even show on his record. Why are they supported to be hidden, yet we have to keep defending ourselves?
Well, that's a really great comment / question. And it's certainly one that I wish not so much that I had an answer to, I wish it would go away. Peace bonds, as long as people follow them, don't form part of a criminal record. The person hasn't been found guilty of anything unless they fail to follow the peace bond or fail to sign it. And certainly there's a lot of that kind of bargaining down. The charge goes away if the abuser agrees to enter into a peace bond. The problem is that, as this person is saying, it can leave the person who's been the victim feeling as though the court didn't take what happened to her very seriously. It's also the case that, let's say, and I'm now not talking about this particular story because I don't know anything about it. So I'm just making a more general statement that often the person will follow the peace bond. Lasts for a year. They don't want to get in more trouble with the law. They do what the peace bond says. The year ends. The victim is still afraid of the person. She's probably not going to be successful in having the peace bond continued past that year because the person behaved. Well, of course they're going to behave. They have every incentive to behave. It's the same with a restraining order. It's the same with supervised access. Very few abusive men are going to behave badly during a supervised access session with their children because somebody's watching them. But does that mean that when that supervision is taken away, they're necessarily going to continue to behave well? No. So we have all of these weird systems in place that make it difficult for the woman to get long-term protection and long-term validation of the seriousness of what has been done to her in the past.
There's one more. If a publication ban was put in place to protect the victim, could victim be okay with sharing name and making the document public? Do they have that option so the publication ban could be removed?
Well, either person, but the only one who would be successful would be the victim. The victim can apply to the court to have the publication ban waived. That's happened in a number of cases. The court understandably wants to be sure that this is actually motivated by the victim, that she's not being manipulated or intimidated by the abuser into asking to have the publication ban lifted. Certainly women in sexual assault cases would be much better off if they had access to free independent legal advice through that whole process so that they would understand the legal implications of decisions that they might make. One of the things that really bothers me about this story that I shared a minute ago in particular is that this woman didn't put it on Twitter or on her Facebook page or phone up a reporter for the Toronto Star or something like that and say, here, I'm going to give you this transcript and it's got everybody's names in it. She told some people in her family and some of her friends. And so I can see why it would never have occurred to her that that was violating the publication ban. A publication ban, what's the word in there? It doesn't say don't tell your family. It says there's a publication ban. Publication to most of us means it gets printed in a newspaper or some other public location. This case is it's really a mess. The only thing that's good about it is that the woman has tremendous support at this point, and it gives us something really strong to advocate for a change in the way the system handles these publication bans. But to answer the question, the only way somebody can legally go public with something that's taken place in a case where there's a publication ban is to apply to the court and be successful in having that ban lifted. Otherwise, they're technically in breach of that order. The Crown could have chosen not to prosecute as well. Let me just be clear about that. There was discretion in several places that seemed to have not been used. Anything else?
Just a comment to say that these were her supports that she had told. Yeah, that's it for now.
Okay. Well, I've just got a couple more things, which is good because it looks like we're getting close to the end of our time. This might seem to some of you to be a really minor point, but when we're talking about language, one of my pet bugaboos is when I get called a lady. I am not a lady unless all of you who are men are gentlemen. Lady equals gentleman, woman equals man, if we're talking about those very gender specific terms. Lady implies, if I'm a lady, if a person refers to me as a lady, I feel that that takes away some of my power as a woman and puts me in a particular category. I'm happy to go there, but that means all you guys have to be gentlemen too. So we need to be parallel in how we talk about, you know, whether it's a woman and a man, or now that we use increasingly non-binary language, in all of those terms, we just need to be careful that we're not talking about one group of people in language that carries a different tone or a different inference than the language we use to describe other people. This is a constantly evolving process, as I said at the beginning of the morning. And on a general basis, as I start to wrap up here, I'm going to suggest you might want to think about within your agency developing a guide on language and how you use language. And you could look at things like, when you're doing a public presentation, how do you talk about the work that you do? Do you talk about domestic violence, family violence, intimate partner abuse? If you work in the area of sexual violence, do you talk about that, sexual violence, or do you talk about sexual assault? You can think about a public presentation, you know, every step through the way. And then in particular, when we talk about violence against women or gender-based violence, because now increasingly that's the language that's being used. What words and terms do we use? How do we deal with the media? How do we deal with social media? And that way you can be sure that everyone in your organization is at a minimum using similar kinds of language, and you're giving a similar kind of message to the public. How we talk about gender-based violence evolves as our own personal understanding of the issue evolves. It also evolves as at the systemic level, our understanding of the issue develops. Coercive control. That term was almost never used just a few years ago, and now it's used all the time. I think it's a really helpful term. It takes us another step in understanding the complexity of the violence that happens within intimate relationships. Some countries have made coercive control a criminal offense. Canada has not, but there is presently a private member's bill in front of the federal government that would make it a criminal offense to engage in coercive controlling behavior. That we could also have a lengthy discussion about. There's definitely pros and cons to both. Regardless of what happens on the criminal side, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that term, coercive control, now exists in the definition of family violence in both the Divorce Act and the Children's Law Reform Act. Another example, we don't say wife abuse anymore because it excludes abuse in relationships where people are not married, where the people are non-binary, where it's a same-sex relationship, and so on. My own use of language is undergoing constant change. I used to say my client experienced abuse, or my client was in an abusive relationship. Then I shifted to saying my client's been subjected to abuse. But then when I started to work on this presentation, I became less and less comfortable with that. My client has been subjected to abuse, because that language still makes her the subject of the sentence. So now I'm trying to remember to say my client's partner subjected her to abuse. And I try to remember to say my client was in a relationship in which her partner abused her, the way Alan Wade suggested in that clip I showed. I also try very, very hard never to call the abuser her abuser, as though this is somebody that she picked for the purpose of him abusing her. Do I get it right every time? Absolutely not, and nor will you. But we can all work on ourselves. So when we talk about what we do, we paint a realistic picture of the problem. To go back to a comment I made earlier in the morning, if we don't name that problem properly, we will not find the right solution to it. I'm hoping that we have a couple of minutes for questions. I'm just going to skip over that slide for a second, though, to say at the very end, we've given you some resources at Luke's Place, but also the Femifesto document I mentioned, Use the Right Words, and the work of Linda Coates and Alan Wade. I highly recommend those resources to you if you want to think more about this issue of language. So Laura, over to you in terms of questions, but also just to cut us off so that we can get to the panel.
So we have about 4 minutes. Any questions or comments, please go ahead and put them into the chat. There is a comment right now that says that would be helpful because they still do it. So it must have been something where you spoke about, even without direct contact, but through family court litigation. Somebody is raising their hand. Oh, clapping. That's a clap.
Okay, that's good.
Yes.
Happy to get claps. I also hear that somebody's cat has joined the session here. I can hear some meowing in the background.
A comment, this has been fascinating as someone who loves words and the power of language.
It is really interesting just to think about how much impact the words that we use can have on how people understand this issue.
There is a question, any recommendations on helping others shift their language, like friends and family who are not in the topic?
Yeah, so for sure, the best way is not to say, oh, you idiot. That's not really how you should talk about it, although sometimes it's tempting to say that for sure. I think the way I try to talk about it is to say things like, you know, when I work with women, they tell me that they don't find it helpful when people ask them why they stayed. And here's some reasons why that's not helpful to them. Or I will say, let's use for an example, she experienced domestic violence. So if I'm with a friend or a family member who says, yeah, this friend of mine, she's been experiencing domestic violence for a long time. And sometimes I try to keep it lighthearted and I'll say, you know, the word experience is kind of usually about something fairly light, like I experienced a great dinner at that restaurant last night. I had a great experience on my summer vacation. And when we're talking about domestic violence, I think it's more important for us to focus on language that is really clear about how serious this is and who's responsible. So it's going to depend on the circumstances, how you talk about it with people, but I do think we have to talk about it. We just have to do it in a way so that the person who we're trying to get to change their language doesn't feel judged for the fact that we're asking them to talk about it differently.
Another comment, this has been a wonderful presentation and the language issues are transferable to other areas of our practice as well. Words matter in all aspects of our practice.
For sure.
Okay.
Oh, maybe I didn't put the link for the first video clip on the PowerPoint slide, but I can send that to Laura and then she can get it out to you. Or you can Google, you know, good old Google. Really, all you have to do is Google TED Talk Jane Gilmore, and it'll take you to it because that's how I found it. Well, let me thank you for sticking with this and listening for 2 hours. It's certainly more difficult for you as well as for me. I really appreciate your attention, and your comments have been really thought-provoking and helpful as we all continue to think about how we use language.
Okay. Thanks so much, Pam, for being here and presenting this today. I've actually seen you present on this topic before, and I learned even more than what I learned the last time, and there's just so much more food for thought So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, so
So I've stopped sharing,
yes.
and now I'm going to become a silent observer,
Mhm.
as you all have been all morning.
So we, as most of the trainings that you guys have been to before our DART trainings, we always make sure that we'd like to do a component with our Voices of Courage. Just remember, I'm going to just remind the Voices of Courage panel members to unmute themselves when I'm asking you your question. The Voices of Courage began about 7 years ago after DART received funding from the Ministry of Children and Community Social Services so that we could have feedback from survivors of domestic abuse about shaping the way we make choices, provide service, and make organizational decisions. The Voices of Courage, a survivor panel, has put together a question and answer segment focused on questions that some people think about when it comes to domestic abuse. Thank you to those of you who completed this survey and sent in your questions. Okay, to get us started, I'm going to call upon our panel member, Lisa. And her question is, do you prefer the term victim, survivor, or people with lived experience? Is there a better language that we could be using when referring to people who have experienced abuse?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to whoever the question originated from. I know the thoughts on this vary from person to person, but I myself am not opposed to any of the terms. And in fact, I use them all myself, as they all have their place. The only terms I really did dislike, which are not mentioned in this particular question, were complainant and witness that were used within the criminal court process, as they were very dehumanizing and really highlighted how little control I had within the process and the scrutiny that I was under while going through that process. In respect to the terms that are mentioned in the question, the term victim was somewhat important in the early part of my journey, just in terms of helping me to process the victimization and the severity of what I had gone through, although survivor was also helpful in a different way at that time. But I still find it to this day necessary to use the term victim in referencing myself and my daughter, especially when dealing with the various court processes such as family court, and even with the corrections and parole board. I feel that it's really important to use this term in that respect, as it truly expresses the victimization of myself and my daughter and the suffering that we have and continue to endure. Whereas survivor in those particular instances gives the impression that it's no longer affecting us. It's not a big issue anymore, or that we're over it, and you are never really over it. Victim also expresses that something bad had happened, and this is extremely important when dealing with those processes, in particular in reference to my daughter, as it often gets overlooked that children in general are also victims and do greatly suffer. The term survivor I often use, as I find this to be greatly empowering, and for me personally, it has described my process from caterpillar to butterfly, so to speak, although it can be used for anyone, even if they are still currently experiencing abuse. Although this term can still hold stigma around it in certain instances, and there are some people that do not like this term at all, so it is highly personal. The term people with lived experience I do also like, as I find that this is less stigmatizing, and it provides more value to the experience that we as survivors do have, which is often overlooked. I think this term is actually underused because I feel that it can be beneficial to survivors to use it more, to assist with involving them more in providing feedback or with employment and that sort of thing, which could be very beneficial. And is there better language that we can be using? Yeah, I mean, use their name first and foremost, because that's who they are. It may be safest to start with referencing them as someone who's experienced abuse. It's not perfect, but it's safe. If you're unsure of what term, if any, should be used, I think it's safe to ask them, what do you think of such and such term? Which I do think people may appreciate, as I actually did, or let them categorize themselves if they even wish to do so, which they may not, you know. And people may also feel differently about different terms at various points in their journey, so it could change along the way. They may reference themselves differently at different points in time. So we need to keep in mind that things can always change, and we really need to be mindful and respectful of that. So I really hope this helps to answer this question. And back to you, Laura.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I'm going to call on Maureen from our panel. The question is, when did you know you stopped loving him? When did you realize it was over?
Hi. Had some time to think about it. The author John Green has a great line in the book, The Fault in Our Stars. And the line is, I fell in love like you would fall asleep, slowly and then all at once. Falling out was a similar experience. Every incident eroded the attachment, the relationship, the marriage, weakened it. And I thought about leaving several times through the years. But the actual moment where everything kind of changed was, there was a final break, came about a year before I actually left. It is the one incident that I can't remember what set him off. And I will preface that by saying nothing ever justified the abuse. But in this circumstance, I cannot remember what was said or not said, done or not done, that precipitated the attack. He walked into the living room and he struck me in the face 3 times and said, I know you're going to pout about this. I'll give you 3 days to get over it. Something snapped in both my head and my heart. And I can only equate it to the sensation of a rubber band snapping due to excess stress. It's hard for maybe someone to understand there was an actual physical sensation. It was like waking up from a coma or coming up from air after having been submerged underwater. And in that instant, after that was probably about the 12th or 13th year of the marriage, I realized this had nothing to do with me. I wasn't responsible for the violence and I couldn't stop it. I'd been trying to solve this for years, and it was just this clarity of, this isn't mine to solve. There's nothing I can do to make a difference. It had nothing to do with me other than the fact that I was an unwilling participant and a target. It was over for that day for me emotionally. I didn't leave right away, but I knew that I would. And I found my first glimmer of hope in that. And at that point, I started laying the groundwork for leaving, knowing that it wouldn't be easy, nor would it go smoothly. He had told me that if I left, he'd kill me, and I had no reason not to believe him. I don't know that everyone gets that moment. There are women who leave after the first episode. It's a one strike and you're out. There are women who never leave. And there are a bunch of us somewhere in the middle who at some point find their way out. And I don't know if everyone gets that moment of clarity, but that's what made the difference for me. And when I look back now, I don't even know that it was love to begin with. It was just a very dysfunctional relationship with some relatively normal stretches interrupted by very violent episodes.
Okay, thanks, Marie. I'm going to call on Amelia. The question is, how can we best support a woman that keeps going back to their abusive partner? And I think you were going to tie in a little bit about why women stay.
Yeah, there are many ways. Some people feel you can whisk your friend away from an abusive situation, but it's not that simple. So one way to support a woman who keeps going back is to understand that a woman goes back to an abusive partner for many, many reasons. It's very complex and difficult to leave. Some feel dependent financially, some share children, some stay because there's a good side to him, for guilt, shame, or they blame themselves. I did have some friends that I talked to about my previous relationship. The physical and mental abuse escalated gradually, and I was afraid he would hurt me if I left. So one friend got frustrated with me and angry when I didn't leave the situation right away. She started to minimize what I was going through. She said it must not be that bad for you to stay, and blame me for what was happening. This only made me feel more isolated, unsupported. So it's important not to give up on your friends in the situation. It's important not to judge them for going back. There are reasons, unfortunately, for staying in the situation. And the best way to support them is to listen, look out for them, and be non-judgmental. Also understanding that leaving can be very dangerous time for a woman. My ex-partner stalked me for months after our final breakup. So for some women, they are afraid and they return. But it's good to mention that during my final breakup, some of my other friends were very supportive by understanding my fear. And they helped me in some very sort of unusual ways, talking to me on the phone while making my way to my car, letting me stay at their homes, talking to me while I was falling asleep if I was alone. So they really understood my fear. And in that way, you can support someone who's in a situation that I was in. And so along with educating yourself about abuse, to educate the survivor, I think would really help. As I said, I did feel isolated in my past relationship. And a lot of times I didn't feel very good about myself because of the emotional abuse. But starting to understand abuse patterns and how they were affecting me helped me sort out my negative thoughts and feelings and ultimately empowered me to leave. So another way to support survivors is to empower them to stay safe while they're in the relationship. Maybe encourage them to take small steps to get out or help them find ways. For me, for example, my friends encouraged me to prepare a safe place in my house for when he blew up. You might offer a phone number to a domestic hotline. So I think, and the last way I think you can help a survivor is to make sure you stay strong. I have tried to help others in abusive situations, and it's a roller coaster. You're relieved when your friend leaves the situation, then you're worried when they go back and you're frustrated with them. Just have to make sure you take care of your own well-being so you can support your friend as well.
Thanks, Amelia. I'm going to call on Patty from our panel. Patty, the question is, do you think there should be more public education in the media about domestic abuse?
Hi. Yes, I definitely agree. There needs to be more public education in the media. As times change, so do the needs of people and the protection that people need. And for over 20 years, the law hasn't been changed or updated. The Family Law Act has been changed. Now it includes 4 things: the best interest of the child, it addresses family violence, and it doesn't just include physical violence anymore. It includes mental, emotional, and physical or financial abuse. It also helps to reduce child poverty and make it more accessible and efficient. My friends and family haven't even heard that these laws have changed. Like, there's very little media out there about it. And I think it's important that people can now look into it and see what can help their family in their situations. Family violence harms everyone, victims and witnesses. It shouldn't be a closed door. We all have the right to grow up in an abuse-free environment. If we can give each other the guidance, patience, and tools to answer the hard questions now, then hopefully those answers will become easier for younger generations because it'll all be just a part of their life. Most of our biggest life learning experiences come from things that affect us most. Our big shining moments, our embarrassing moments, mistakes. Sometimes it only takes a story by someone else that we hear that touches us enough to make a change within our heart and make a change in our own views. So public education and media can be the change for that.
Thanks, Patty. Another one of our panel members is Danielle. And Danielle's question was how to ask someone tactfully if they are currently at risk. She couldn't be with us this morning. So she sent me her answer and I'm going to read it. I think this question could be answered a lot of different ways, depending on who's answering it and their own experiences, as well as I think it's important to consider the circumstance in which you are planning to ask someone if they are at risk. Not every situation may be or feel safe for the person to answer honestly, and sometimes a person at risk may not be able to or ready to identify that they are at risk. From my experience, it can also depend on who is asking and how much trust has been built. I speak on this from experience. Some of the abusive situations I survived I was not ready to identify what I was experiencing as abuse or recognize the extent of danger I was in. And when it did come to the realization on my own, I was scared to be honest about what was taking place. I felt ashamed. I felt that it was my fault. What stuck out to me the most was the last time I was at risk when someone who noticed something was off with me or the situation would ask how I was doing, if I needed anything, rather than pushing me to tell me the situation I was in. I didn't feel pushed to give an answer they expected, and it gave me time to build up trust to eventually tell someone that I needed help. One other question that I was not able to answer truthfully most of the time, but it didn't make me feel pushed to give an answer or that I was being judged, was when I was asked if I had a safe place to go in an emergency situation or in moments that were emergencies. It made me feel like the person asking cared, as well as I was being given an out if I decided to leave. I truly believe if someone had pushed me to tell me what was going on, I would have stayed longer because I would have started to isolate myself even more to avoid those conversations. I think no matter what, with every situation, it's important to go into it without judgment and to let the person you believe to be at risk take the lead whenever possible. I'm going to call on Maureen just to share some last minute thoughts.
Hi. This has been a fascinating morning. And due to the work of Pamela Cross, my fellow panel members from the Voices of Courage, we've learned a lot about the power of language and the language surrounding domestic abuse. What we're learning, of course, is that language matters, and we all know the power of words, the words we use and the words we hear. Now, you can tell me it's raining outside, or you can tell me that there's a thunderstorm. That conjures up very different images. Both tell you that you're going to get wet if you go outside. You can tell me it's hot today or that it's sweltering. Sometimes a very subtle shift in language makes a big difference. It can change how information is provided and received, and that's the power of language. Historically, we've used the reference victim of domestic violence, and I'd like to take a minute to look at both terms, victim and domestic violence. I share some of the thoughts we've heard earlier. I have a couple of different opinions because everybody's experience is different. The term domestic, we have domestic violence, domestic abuse, or intimate partner violence. The common term has typically been domestic violence, but that's giving way to other references, domestic abuse or intimate partner abuse. And I'd like to believe that our panel, Voices of Courage, has contributed to that change. Intimate partner abuse is also a great option because it's more inclusive. It encompasses more relationships such as dating. You don't have to be living with someone or married to them to be abused. Domestic violence only infers physical violence. And what imagery does that bring to mind? A black eye, a swollen lip, violence. Scars you see when it's escalated to its most serious stage. It only captures the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't account for the mental, emotional, and verbal abuse that leaves the foundation for the physical abuse. The term domestic violence is too narrow a view and leaves the victim to think she's not in an abusive relationship because he's never hit her. And I've personally heard women say, it's not domestic violence, he never hit me. An abusive relationship rarely starts with a punch in the face. There's generally be a long, steady path of erosion you're not seeing, a slow slide into something that she's convinced herself is somehow normal. So I have a preference to define it as abuse. That picks up all of it. We've heard terms like victim, survivor, and lived experience. I find victim can be a very vulnerable word. You're at the whim of the perpetrator. And sometimes it tells the woman and those around her who she is or was in the abuser's eye. She's his victim. It can be a very narrow perspective. You've also heard the term person with lived experience. And we're trying to be more politically correct. Sometimes it becomes much more so. If we're able, we're always concerned about mislabeling, but it is an acceptable alternative to victim, someone who is experiencing domestic abuse or intimate partner violence. Now, survivor to me tells the truth about who she is. She's not his victim, she is a survivor. That this is serious, potentially fatal, And as long as she survived, she's a survivor. Whether she's in the early stages of reclaiming her life and her right to live safe and happy, or she's much further down the road in rebuilding the process. Survivor reminds her and those around her that had things turned out differently, she could have died, but she didn't. And not dying is a pretty big accomplishment. She's a survivor until she's not, whether she's surviving it on a daily basis or has found her way out. Sometimes I think in terms that she's a victim if she doesn't survive it. A victim of domestic abuse, a homicide victim. Survivor, victim, sometimes there's no in between. Better yet, let her tell you who she is. In this process, she's generally lost a very big piece of who she is, and it's time for her to reclaim her own identity. Pamela referenced the term witness earlier, and that struck me because it's probably very accurate in the court scenario, but to me, it implies she saw, not she experienced. A neighbor or a family member could equally be a witness. So sometimes the terms we use are very situation specific. When we're talking about someone with lived experience, I think that provides a very interesting perspective. In many of the support agencies, they're staffed with people who have a great deal of education and a great deal of experience in supporting these women. And those are two really important components of that. But recently, more survivors are speaking out, adding the perspective of women who've experienced abuse at the hands of an intimate partner, and that completes the picture. That's what we're trying to do with Voices of Courage. Is it's an ugly, dark secret. Nobody knows what goes on behind closed doors, and we're working towards giving victims, survivors, giving everyone a voice and an ability to speak about their experience. It's not easy, it's not pretty, but nobody said it would be. And I think what we've seen this morning is we don't have the perfect term that captures this very complicated scenario. But the world is not perfect, because if it was, we wouldn't be having this particular conversation this morning. This is not a perfect situation.
I did, and sorry, I'm just in the middle of something. Let me just
So
stop the video.
maybe the purpose of this discourse is just to challenge the language we use and think about it, and maybe the best we can do in each situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think we hands up, thumbs up, claps. Thank you so much to each one of the panel members for sharing their thoughts about some of the questions. I could see the hearts and the claps increasing on the side of my screen. So thank you very much to the Voices of Courage. Thank you to each of you for being open to hearing some of these suggestions and the thoughts, and hopefully you have a lot to take back. Thank you to Pam again. I think we're okay to end our session. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.